Hello, welcome to another episode of CI Immersion. My name is Andrew Snyder, and I'm the host of the CI Immersion podcast. This is episode number 2. This podcast is really aimed at language instructors. So if you're a language learner and you're getting this episode on the Listen, Read, Interact feed, it could be of some use to you. You might learn some things, but really it's aimed at language teachers. And so if you're a language instructor, this is my attempt at sharing my complete language acquisition system that I really use in my college classroom and at the Tacoma Language Academy. I use this exact system because it's something that I've developed over the last, I don't know how many years I've been teaching, 15, 16, 17, some absurd amount of years that doesn't make sense to me that I've been teaching so long. Over that time, I've really learned a lot of things, and this system has evolved over the years. And I am always improving it. I'm always trying to tinker and get it to hum like a purring engine. And really what this is an acquisition engine. It's comprehension-based. It's proficiency-driven. It is an acquisition-driven instruction system. It is an acquisition engine. If you think about an engine in terms of software development, it's a program that performs a certain task. So, for example, Stripe is a payments engine. If you've ever used Stripe before, I know I use Stripe for when I ask for donations and things like that. Stripe is one of the ways that people can donate, and it's an engine. That's what its purpose is. It performs a certain task. And so in the classroom, what I really want to do is build an acquisition engine, and that's what CI Immersion is. Really what it is it's a collection of smaller systems that is each designed to do a specific task that enables the end result. And if you can think about a car engine, that car engine turns fuel into mechanical energy, fuel into motion. And so there's a ton of little small systems on there. There's the belts that connect to the alternator. There's the valves that go up and down. There's the timing belt that makes sure everything fires in order. There's all sorts of moving pieces that work together to turn the fuel into motion. Well, our brain has a model inside of it. Obviously, in episode 1 of the CI Immersion podcast, I talked in pretty great detail about how it is that we acquire language. And basically, in a nutshell, in a 30-second review, we acquire language by hearing messages and reading messages in the target language that our brain processes and turns into a mental model. It builds a mental model of the language inside our head that we then use to communicate things. And so the fuel for acquisition is what we call input. It's that stream of language that we hear and read. That's the fuel that our brain turns into acquired language. It turns it into the mental model. It turns it into the motion. So our brain takes that data and it builds out a mental model of the language. And so our goal as instructors is to build this acquisition engine. We want a bunch of small systems that run together that purr like a car engine. And it turns that input our brains then take that input and it turns it into the mental model. So in our classroom, in the CI Immersion classroom, the acquisition engine provides learners that steady stream of input and processing opportunities. It gives them the chance to process the language internally. And the brain does its own thing. The brain will take care of itself. Once you give it the fuel, it takes care of itself. And so our job then is to build these little systems that get as many input processing opportunities as we can for learners. So there are many steps to this thing, and the CI immersion process has a bunch of steps to it, and each one has subsystems, and so it's actually quite complicated, but the main idea is simply to get learners processing the language as much as we can from the very beginning of class. Now, there are some steps actually to this, and if I try to count them, let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's really like 6 phases to the CI immersion system. And the first one is I call it first steps. Now, first steps really are for the instructor, and they're really for getting things organized. A lot of times when we're trying to build out systems, making things organized is so complicated because there's so many things we have to teach. There's so much vocabulary we have to go through. There's so much, so many grammar items that we might want to introduce here and there. And whether we explicitly teach them or implicitly teach them, there's so many decisions that you have to make. For me, though, if you can get through these first steps, then it kind of clears the plate for you a little bit. And so there's things like, for example, defining your scope. What are you going to teach? Sometimes that's well defined and sometimes it's not. And you do have to define this because otherwise you're not aiming at anything. And if you don't aim at anything, then you're going to miss the target every time. Student outcomes. A lot of times these are predetermined. A lot of times these are definitely predetermined for me when I teach at the college. They're predetermined outcomes that sometimes came from a long time ago. Sometimes they've been reworked recently, but then it's like, is this really a good outcome? Sometimes they're very vague. Determining all sorts of things. Are you going to teach with stories? And CI Immersion for me is very story-based. There's lots of stories that happen in my classroom because it's a wonderful vehicle for acquisition. Are there specific items that might help you along your way? Like, do you have to teach something like telling the date or telling time? Those are great little things to know that you have to teach because then they can work themselves into their own little routine, part of the day. High-frequency vocabulary. What high-frequency vocabulary do you want them to take away from the class? Like, if your students leave your class and they can only say so many things, they might as well say some high-frequency things because that'll help them the most in the real world. So there's all sorts of things like that you need to determine. But once you get through those things, and I would include in this first steps also like writing a syllabus and making general course information and trying to figure it out in terms of how it will be graded and other elements that you might have to require, updating your syllabus if you've already got one, doing things like completing your learning management system setup and if you have homework, how to do homework systems, make a calendar so you can kind of figure out where it is that you're going to go. Limiting task creep. Task creep is one of those things where you can I'm going to teach this. Oh, I'm going to teach this. I'm going to teach this. No, limiting that scope and sequence, defining what it is ahead of time, figuring out all that stuff ahead of time. So those are the first steps. And that doesn't really show up in the classroom immediately, but it makes your life easier down the road. And so I would start with that. I would say, okay, I've got disorganization is a problem, task creep is a problem, and, burnout from ordinary teaching tasks is also a problem we want to avoid. And so if we can address those easily, then, and at the beginning also, not just easily, but at the beginning, then later on, they're not so much of a problem. Like the disorganization, if you can figure that out at the beginning, then okay, you're going to be a lot more organized as you go. Whereas if you just jump in, and I know for me that's a huge temptation, then you're going to be disorganized. And you might be disorganized anyway. There's so much that goes into this. But starting to tackle that disorganization from the beginning, I think, is key. Task creep, again, defining your scope and sequence. If you can do that, that's wonderful. And then try to figure out some systems that will help you from burning out on those ordinary teaching tasks. Those things like taking attendance and grading and things like that. Things that might be a problem for you down the road. Look at them now before you start teaching. And so something you might do for disorganization, if that's an issue for you, write a syllabus and write one that reflects CI immersion or CI storytelling or whatever it is that you're going to implement. If task creep is a problem, define that scope and sequence and limit it. Really limit it. Say, okay, we're gonna teach this vocab. I'm gonna define it. This is the vocab I'm gonna teach, and everything else is going to be bonus vocab. It's incidental stuff that comes along for the ride. And if burning out from ordinary teaching tasks, well, develop efficient systems that help you get through those things quickly and avoid burnout. So the first thing is first steps, things that are going on behind the scene. The next portion of CI immersion, the next phase, I call it the pre-story phase. And I know a lot of people who will start to do CI storytelling on the very first day. And I've done that before. And in fact, I'm trying to think, did I do that this quarter? I might have even started this quarter. I think I waited till day 2. But I start very quickly with this. But it helps to have kind of a pre-story phase. And in this one, you're going to introduce vocabulary. And I would target high frequency vocabulary in this phase. So in the first steps, you're organizing yourself, and in this pre-story phase, you're already in the classroom and you're starting to begin introducing high-frequency vocabulary that will serve you well when you get into the storytelling phase a little bit later on. And so words like to want, to have, to be, to go, to like, to put, those sorts of high-frequency verbs are very useful because they allow you to tell a lot of vocabulary. They allow you to tell a lot of stories. And if you can start telling stories, you're going to start processing many messages, or the learner will. You'll start to deliver many messages that the learner can process. And in this phase, there's something I call orbiting, which I can get into, and I will get into in a later episode. It's like asking a bunch of questions. If you've ever done a TPRS seminar, it's very similar to one of those. And I can walk you through my process there, which is very similar to something like that, like the circling that they talk about. You're going to be doing a lot of talking in this phase, especially if the learners are brand new. If it's a Spanish 1 class or a French 1 class or German 1 class, the students often have no background in the language or very little background in the language. And so you're going to need to target this vocabulary, and you're going to be doing a lot of talking, and the learners are going to be doing a lot of processing. And so there are systems that you can put in place that will help you do this in a very, very nice way. You can use student-driven curriculum in this phase. Have them draw something, and then you talk about what they've drawn, and you're talking about it. And you're ensuring comprehension. You're ensuring that the processing is taking place by asking them, hey, do you get that? Does that make sense? Looking around the room, looking at people, looking for that deer in the headlights look. TPR, Total Physical Response, is a wonderful tool in this phase. I use it extensively. And in fact, I'm redesigning my Spanish 1 TPR right now in a way that's very, very effective. And I'll talk about that on a later episode as well. I just stumbled upon something that combines TPR with storytelling at a very, very early phase, and I really like it. So I will detail that one later. And so basically your whole goal with this phase, and it can last a week, it can last 2 weeks, it can last 3 weeks, it can last a month, however long you can get it to last, probably the better. But at a certain point, I would transition into telling a story. And maybe sooner rather than later, I don't know. There's various ways to go about it. CI immersion is very flexible. It will let you go right into storytelling, or it will let you take your time and build to storytelling. The next phase on the list I've got here is telling the story. And I always use TPR as a foundational piece to telling the story. I will target a number of phrases. Generally 6 is the number I found to be worth targeting. You could target 4 or 3 or 10 or 12. I know that when I was learning Spanish myself, my teacher used long lists of TPR words and phrases and verbs and nouns and adjectives and all of this. And it was very useful. I learned a lot of vocabulary that way, and that's fine too. There's many ways you could go about this. I found 6 to be a good number for me. You might find it to be more beneficial to have more or less. It's just also kind of depends on how much time you have with people. But I find that 6 phrases, not necessarily individual words, but 6 phrases are nice, self-contained blocks of language that if the learners know this phrase, they're going to be able to tell some version of the story that we'll end up with. Now, a lot of times I will start with a script. And especially when I was first beginning this, a script was very useful for me because I'm trying to figure out in my head, okay, how do I keep the story straight? Well, if I've got something to look at in my hand, I can continually look down at this script that I've got, either something that I've written or something from online or something from somewhere. I'm able to refer back to it and keep myself organized, keep myself on track, keep myself from getting lost, which can derail the whole thing. If you get lost when you're telling one of these stories, it's going to look kind of silly and you're not going to feel great about it and all of that. So having a sheet of paper there to kind of glance at is a very wonderful way of keeping yourself on track and remembering stuff. There's many things to do with this, so I'll go into this in more depth on a later episode as well, but telling the story in this phase is where we're at. And this is my favorite part. I will tell you this is my favorite part of the whole process is we've gone through the first steps where I'm totally organized. Now I'm ready to go. The pre-story phase where I'm building up high frequency vocabulary and then telling a story. And telling this story is so much fun for me because the students really shine. They're really creative. Funny things happen. Students always want silly things to happen to the characters that we talk about. I'm able to present culture in context as it arises. So if somebody sneezes in the story, I can say, oh, en español no se dice God bless you, en español se dice salud. And then I can even go further and I can have someone pretend to sneeze and I say, hey, when someone sneezes in Spanish once, you say salud. And then if they do it again, you can also say salud, dinero. And then if they say it again, you can say salud, dinero, amor. And I practice that with students. So there's real life culture. That's a real thing that happens. And it's in context, and students learn it and know it forever. Because it's in context, it happens in the classroom in a real, authentic way. Beyond telling the story, the next phase is writing and reading the story. Now, there's various ways you could go about this. Maybe you have a parallel reading that's already written for yourself, and then you go on to read that version of the story. But reading is so critical because reading is a system that sits on top of listening in your brain. So when you read a text, most people hear their own voice reading that text out loud. And what that tells us is that listening activates the same centers of the brain as listening. Did I say that? Maybe I said that backwards. Reading activates the same centers in your brain as listening. And so we want to have our students read. Our learners need to read, and they need to read a lot. And they can read on their own. They can read silently. They can read in pairs. There's all sorts of ways you can get students to read. And reading something familiar is very useful because the comprehension will be high. And when the comprehension is high, then the learner is able to process more messages. And when they're able to process more messages, more acquisition takes place. So that's what I'm all about. I'm all about it. And so we're going to write or read the story. You can take the exact same story that you did in class and type it up. That might be a bit of a cumbersome activity, especially if you have 5 or 6 classes. That's a lot. I know that when I have 4, it's quite a bit. It's quite a bit to write 4 unique stories. And I end up writing a couple of versions of the story, so I'm writing even more. But I enjoy it, and so I do it. And I think it is the best way to do it, in my opinion, because it gives learners something very focused that they can read and something they've already heard. And so reading it then is very familiar to them. And so they're processing again in new words. A lot of times I'll make the story that's written a bit more complicated than the spoken version. And the students are asked then to read the more complicated version, but it's approachable and doable because they were able to understand over several days this spoken version that was told together. I've heard of some people having some tricks and tips to try and get the story written, including having a student write it out, having them try to type it up and things like that. So there's ways around you having to do all of the typing. And that's useful. That's a system we can talk about when we target specifically the writing of the story, which we'll do at a later time. But reading the story is important, and I firmly believe that once you have told a story, you should read at least a parallel version of that story, if not a version of this exact same story. The next phase beyond reading and writing that story is guiding learners from input to output. A lot of people in the CI, quote-unquote CI space, CI world, comprehensible input world, will shy away from output. And I don't really have a problem with that because output does not cause acquisition. Acquisition happens because we process understandable messages in the language. But output, I think, does perform some function. It's got to do something. I don't think it does nothing. And one of the things it might do is to test hypotheses. So your brain is testing hypotheses, even at a subconscious level, about the language. It's like, okay, maybe the language works like this, and they try to communicate something, and if they're successful, the brain says, hey, good job, let's keep going with that. And if the feedback is such that, hey, I didn't communicate what I wanted to, the brain says, no, we need to change that model. So I think that does play a role. And so I want to have my learners move from input to output, even if it's very structured and very guided. In fact, in a Spanish 1 class or a French 1 class or a Portuguese 1 class, you will need to structure your output in a way that makes it achievable, attainable for learners. And so that's really what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to extend that story and take themes from the story, and I want to figure out questions that I might be able to ask that are relevant to the story, and then pose those questions to learners about learners. And so that's really what this phase is all about. And there's tons of ways to do that, like true or false quizzes and surveys and sentence scrambles and things like that. So there's lots of things that might be something that a learner would be able to accomplish, a task that they might be able to do. And so that's what this phase is about. It's about moving learners from input to output through simple tasks. And maybe at the end of it all, I've got some open-ended questions at the end of it all, or maybe a complete the sentence type thing, or things like that. So there's lots of things you can do here. But our goal is to move learners from input, give them more input, but then structure it in a way that at the end of it all, they're able to produce something in the language. Even if you're giving them cues on how to respond, having them try to externalize the language will, really what it does is it ensures that processing is taking place. And so we've gone from the first steps, kind of the planning idea, the pre-story phase where you're trying to build vocabulary enough to where you can start telling a story that makes sense and is actually a little bit interesting, telling a story in the target language, writing and reading the story, or just reading a parallel version that you've found somewhere, or you've pre-written or something like that, guiding from input to output, and then the last phase of the CI immersion system is assessment. Assessment. Yes. Really check in on learners. And there's many ways to assess learners. There's formative and summative ways, and there's rubrics that you can find and rubrics that you can make. And are we going to do a timed write? Are we going to do a vocab quiz? Are we going to do a retell of a story? There's many things we can do. And I will talk about my favorite activities in a later episode. But that's the basic idea. We've got first steps, kind of organizing yourself, a pre-story phase where you're building up high-frequency vocabulary for learners, telling a story in the target language, and only the target language, writing a version of it if you can, and if not, a parallel version that students will read, guiding from input to output, assessing what we've done. Assessing learners in their proficiency. Are they making strides in their proficiency? Are they getting better? And the answer to that question is if they've done all these steps, you've gone through a pre-story phase, you've told a story together over several days of class, you've read a version of the story, they've maybe read it at home and practiced it at home or something, and then they've gone through more activities where the themes that were present in that story were used to give more input that led to some output, and then you assess them, they're ready for those assessments. They're ready for those assessments, and they pass them with flying colors almost every single time. And so that is what the CI immersion system is all about. And I will go into further details about all of these phases, these 6 phases, and the various systems that are included, and the various activities you might be able to use, and the various things you might be able to pick from to make this system work in your context. So CI immersion is this complete system that's really story focused and proficiency driven and comprehension based, and it's a complete system. It will let you plan out your entire year or your entire term. Like I teach in quarters, and so I've got a 10-week rolling system that when I'm done with the one quarter, I just roll it into the next quarter and just keep going. And students that take my Spanish 1 class then go into my Spanish 2 class, and there's like no hesitancy. All of a sudden we've rolled over to the next quarter. We're covering new topics, we're covering new things that we're supposed to cover that we've determined as a department, but all of a sudden the systems are just humming along, and I have very little work to do. When I get to Spanish 2, my students already know the drill. And there's a few new students that come in, and they very quickly pick up what the drill is because they see what everyone else is doing and they follow along. The class is basically already normed in this way. It's a wonderful, wonderful system. And I'm going to share it with you step by step over the coming episodes. Now, I am also teaching while I'm doing this, and so it will not happen all at once. But as I find time, I will be, and I want to do it thoroughly. I want to make sure that I really share this entire system with you. And so over time, I will share this entire system on this podcast, on the CI Immersion podcast. You can subscribe on Apple and Spotify, and I think I even got it up on YouTube, and so you can find out wherever that is. There's probably other places I can submit it, but I'm busy, I'm busy. And so I will limit probably the amount of time I spend on doing some of that stuff, but I will be making more episodes of this, and I will be taking you step by step through the various phases, all 6 phases. We'll look at stuff in great detail. And where maybe I talked about it a little bit today, we'll talk about it in great detail going forward. So that is CI Immersion. First steps, the storytelling, the pre-story phase, the storytelling phase, the writing and reading of the story, the guiding from input to output, and assessment. Those are the 6 phases. First steps, pre-story phase, telling the story, writing and reading the story, guiding from input to output, and assessment. And that is what I've got for you today. Hey, muchas gracias. Muito obrigado. We'll see you next time.